Imagine standing in a silent field at dusk. The sky is the color of a fresh bruise, purple, heavy and cold. You are surrounded by 1,000 faces, a sea of humanity pressing in, yet the silence is absolute. You aren't listening for a shout. You aren't waiting for a speech. The only sound you are waiting for is the movement of a rusted iron hinge. It is a sharp, sudden noise, metal screaming against metal, that cuts through the low moan of the wind. That sound signals that the barrier between the safety of the fold and the jagged teeth of the wilderness has just moved. We live in an hour where everyone claims to hold the key to that gate. Every screen, every politician, every self-help guru shouts that they have the code to the lock. Yet we feel a persistent, gnawing chill. We suspect that the person standing at the entrance doesn't actually know our names. In the 10th chapter of John, we find a collision of worlds. On one side, the religious elite men who spent their entire lives measuring the height of the temple walls, obsessed with the architecture of holiness. On the other side, a man who looked like a commoner but spoke like the architect of the universe. These leaders held the keys to the institution, yet Jesus looked at them and spoke of a thief. He describes someone who doesn't use the door but climbs over the wall. Why? Because the thief cannot pass the test of the entrance. It was a devastating realization for the listeners. Being inside the building didn't mean you belonged to the shepherd. You can be in the pews, you can be in the fold, and still be a stranger to the gatekeeper. Notice the precision of the text. The entry into the fold isn't a grand, chaotic procession. It is a specific, legal transaction between a gatekeeper and a caller. The rusted iron hinge only moves for the one who has the legal right to the lock. The sheep in the Judean wilderness weren't looking for a fancy staff or a golden robe. They were listening for a resonance, a vocal fingerprint. They recognized this frequency before they even had names for the stars. It's a biological, spiritual recognition. Deep calls unto deep. The question isn't, do you know the shepherd? But does the shepherd know you well enough to call your name? But the tone shifts and the air gets colder. The fold is not a vacuum, it is a target. Jesus warns of the hired hands. These are people who look like shepherds when the sun is high and the grass is green. They wear the gear, they carry the bag, but they have a knife hidden in their sleeve, not to protect the sheep, but to serve themselves. The hired hand is defined by one thing, the howl. When the first howl of a wolf echoes off the canyon walls, the hired hand calculates the cost. He doesn't own the sheep, so he doesn't own the risk. When the shadow stretches long and the teeth show, he is the first to run, leaving the flock to the silence of the slaughter. He said it plainly, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. It is a threefold erosion of your soul. First, he steals your peace. Then, he kills your hope. Finally, he destroys your identity. If the gate is the only way to safety, why do so many of us find ourselves staring at a wall we cannot climb? Why does the abundant life feel like a rumor heard from a distance while we sit in the dust of the enclosure? This is the great redefinition. Jesus doesn't just say he knows the way, he makes a claim that shatters the logic of the world. He says, I am the gate. He is the rusted iron hinge itself. He is the singular point of articulation through which every soul must pass. You don't get to the pasture by being good enough to jump the wall. You don't get there by studying the gate. You get there by passing through him. He is the narrow opening that leads to the infinite field. During the winter of Solomon's colonnade, a crowd gathered, demanding clarity. If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. They wanted a political manifesto. They wanted a plan to overthrow Rome. They wanted a king who would fix their taxes. But Jesus gave them a shepherd song. He told them, you believe not, because you are not of my sheep. It wasn't that the evidence was missing. It was that their frequency was wrong. They were tuned to the station of power, while he was broadcasting on the station of sacrifice. If you can't hear the voice, no amount of evidence will ever be enough. The weight of this truth becomes a physical burden in Bethany. Lazarus is dead. The atmosphere is thick with the smell of burial spices and the sound of wailing. The sisters are standing by a tomb that feels like the ultimate locked gate, the one gate that never swings back. When Jesus arrives, he doesn't offer a theological treatise on the afterlife. He doesn't give a 5-step plan to deal with grief. He orders them to move the stone. He stands before the final cold entrance, demanding that the rusted iron hinge of death itself be forced open by his command. "Lazarus, come forth." It is the same voice from the sheepfold, now echoing in the dark chamber of a grave. The man who was dead for 4 days, whose body had already begun the process of return to dust, hears the vibration. The strips of linen cannot hold him because the one who owns the life has called the name. The shepherd has not just protected the flock, he has stepped into the mouth of the ultimate wolf and dragged his sheep back out. Think about that rusted iron hinge in your own life. You've been listening for its sound in every news cycle, every sermon, and every late-night anxiety attack. You've been hoping it would finally swing shut against the chaos of the world, locking the fear outside. You felt the draft coming through the gap in the door, wondering if the one who called you has forgotten to check the lock. If you know that voice, if you've heard it whispering, "Peace, be still," in the middle of your own private winter type, I know his voice in the comments. Let us see how many of the remnant are awake and listening today. Your testimony is the sound of the hinge moving for someone else. As the Passover approached, the scene shifted from a tomb to an upper room. The shepherd took off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, and began to wash the dust of the world off the feet of the sheep. He knew that in a few hours, the strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter, prophecy would begin. He knew the gate would be struck. He walked toward the cross, not as a victim, but as the sovereign. "No man takes my life from me, but I lay it down of myself." In the darkness of Golgotha, the shepherd became the gate by being broken. The spear in his side and the nails in his hands created the opening. He allowed the sheep to pass through his own wounds into a pasture where no thief can ever follow. The gate isn't just a door, it's a person who was torn open so you could walk through. The world will tell you there are many ways over the wall: education, wealth, politics, or the safety of the majority. But a wall is just a barrier for those who don't know where the entrance is. The shepherd is still calling. It's a low, steady sound. The rusted iron hinge is moving right now. Are you standing close enough to hear the voice that knows your name?